A lot of people are very familiar with the first generation of Pokémon, but sometimes it feels like people know it mostly for being buggy and glitchy and messed up more than anything. And I kinda get that. I mean, it has Missing though, which is like the glitch of all time. But in a way, I think it's a bit of a shame because, honestly, the first generation of Pokémon is kind of really impressive. Typically, when you think of a game that's just notoriously glitchy and buggy, you're thinking of something that had a very rushed or mismanaged development cycle, and I don't really think that's the case with the first generation of Pokémon. If anything, Pokémon Red and Green feel more like passion projects than anything. The team behind these games consisted of only 9 people, and they worked on it for over 6 years. It released near the end of the Game Boy's life cycle, and Nintendo weren't super bothered by it. And despite all that, it had a obviously pretty fucking big impact on the world. So that's pretty cool. If anything, the first generation of Pokémon is as buggy and messed up as it is, not due to a lack of caring, but probably more so due to a lack of experience. And the games are as good as they are despite that inexperience due to a whole lot of caring. And because of that, I've got a ton of respect for the first generation of Pokémon. That being said, would like 1 or 2 more ghost types have fucking killed you? Like, what is this? So I really do love RBY, but despite that, there is some stuff in here that I just kind of don't get at all. Like, when you're making a game with 15 types, and 151 Pokemon to slap those types onto, you'd think you'd want to distribute them fairly evenly. No, that is absolutely not what happened. There is enough poison in these fucking games to give my local Chipper a run for its money, and water is not far behind. Meanwhile, we got 3 dragon types and 3 ghost types, and those 3 dragon types and 3 ghost types make up 1 evolutionary line each. So the diversity isn't that great here. I've always found the lack of ghost types in RBY really jarring because RBY itself puts a weirdly big focus on the ghost type. Like, there was the entirety of Lavender Town, which gets a weirdly big focus. Like, it had its whole ass tower full of ghost Pokemon, and there's that plot point with the Marowak, and like, there's a ghost type Elite 4 member who has not a full team of ghost Pokemon, but a full team of poison type Pokemon. Because like, what the fuck else was she supposed to do? Another thing that's kind of weird to me about the ghost type is that not only are there only 3 ghost types, but it seems like there were only ever planned to be 3 ghost types. Like, yeah, there's also only 3 dragon types in RBY, but apparently there were more planned that just didn't make the cut. Over the years, we've been made aware to many Pokemon that ended up getting scrapped during RBY's development, and among them are some Pokemon that were most likely dragon types. First off, there's this silly looking guy called Crocky, and more notably, there's a line of Pokemon supposedly based off Chinese water dragons, which like, surely, right? It seems that things were a lot less clear-cut for the ghost type though. Our best bet seemed to be this balloon Pokemon called Burunda, which, you know, we don't know the type for sure, but I guess it does give Drifblim vibes, so maybe. And this thing. Some people have theorized that this is Sarinzu, a cut ghost-type Pokemon found in the Space World 1997 demo of Pokemon Gold and Silver. Development of Gold and Silver took place really soon after Red and Green were finished, so maybe this was also considered for RBY? It's hard to say, but yeah. To be fair though, I know that like the concept for Pokemon as a whole stemmed from Satoshi Tajiri's love of exploring the countryside as a kid, and I can imagine that while exploring that countryside, he probably ran into more fish and silly bugs than fucking ghosts. So I kinda get it, I guess. So moving on from the fact that there are only 3 ghost-type Pokemon, there are also only 3 ghost-type moves, which to be fair is actually kind of okay. I mean, the dragon type only got 1, and it basically does not exist, and surprisingly, it's more than the rock type, which only got 2. That kinda caught me off guard the first time I found that out. But yeah, there are 3 ghost type moves, and honestly, they are not super interesting, unfortunately. You've got Confuse Ray, Nightshade, and Lick. Out of the three, I'd say Confuse Ray is definitely the most notorious, and that might seem strange to say, because despite the fact it's the only 100% consistent means of confusing the opponent in RBY, you don't really see it in Overused at all. The only two notable Pokemon that get it are Lapras and Gengar, and Lapras is rare and doesn't always run the move, and Gengar just kind of has better things to do. You'll occasionally run into it, but it's only on the silliest of Gengars who are just kinda goofing off more than anything. It's mostly just a gimmick and Overused. Confuse Ray's notoriety stems from certain lower tiers, specifically on Lapras in UU and Golbat in 7U. People fucking hate this shit, and potential bans for Confuse Ray have been discussed for both tiers. Unlike Gengar and Lapras in Overused, Lapras in Underused and Golbat in 7U are top tier Pokemon that are very bulky for their respective metas, and because of that, they can kind of afford to throw off a Confuse Ray here and there. Like, it's a lot harder to punish these Pokemon in these tiers for a bad Confuse Ray, or Confuse Ray simply not giving them the luck that they need. If you're using Confuse Ray in Overused, you're essentially going, man, I hope this works, cause I'm in trouble if it doesn't. Whereas in UU and 7U, you're pretty much going, I don't really care if this doesn't work, but if it does, you're fucked. Confuse Ray on bulky top tier Pokemon can just make the game really coin flippy, and while that kind of applies to Overused as well, Gengar and Lapras in Overused aren't amazing at capitalizing off winning that 50-50, while they can get punished really hard for losing it, so they'd rather stick to more consistent options. Also, one more thing, Ninetales is in Never Used and it gets Confuse Ray, but I don't think people mind that one. Ninetales is like super low mid tier, I think, so it's like, you know, it's doing its best, it's no biggie. Ninetales has beaten the Confuse Ray allegations. You love to see it. Despite having a really sick name, Nightshade is unfortunately a fairly uninteresting move. Only the Gengar line gets it, and it's just a clone of Seismic Toss for the most part, so as long as you're at level 100, it will do a consistent 100 HP of damage to every single Pokemon in the game. Compared to Seismic Toss, it has one small downside and one small upside. The downside is that it has less PP than Seismic Toss, but the upside is that, unlike Seismic Toss, it's unaffected by counter. Gengar is the only Pokemon in the game that has Nightshade and Seismic Toss, so it's the only one that has to make a choice, but generally people stick with Nightshade. Gengar shouldn't really be sticking around long enough to run out of Nightshade PP, and I'd say that running Seismic Toss can potentially put you in a nasty situation versus some Chansey sets, so it makes sense that people stick with Nightshade. Lastly, Lick is the only source of Ghost-type damage in the game, and it's a pretty fucking bad one at that. Lick is exclusive to the Gengar line and Jinx, all four of which are not exactly inclined to use a 20 base power physical move. So yeah, that kind of immediately means it's a write-off. And yes, I know, epic RBY moment, Lickitung does not learn Lick. It wouldn't use it even if it did, but I was pretty sure it learned it in Yellow, but no, it's only available via tradebacks, and you know how it is.
That's illegal!
The only notable thing about Lick is the fact it comes with a 30% chance to paralyze the opponent. And on Gastly and Haunter, that makes it technically your most consistent means of dishing out paralysis. That's definitely not a selling point, and it's completely pointless on Gengar and Jinx because they have Body Slam, but it's definitely a thing. Not one I'd recommend, but very much a thing. Speaking of Ghost-type damage, we should probably talk about how the Ghost-type interacts with the other types in the game. And honestly, this will be pretty quick, there's not a whole lot to talk about. Offensively, the Ghost-type is ludicrously basic. It has no effect against Normal and Psychic, is resisted by nothing, and is super effective only against Ghost, which is ironically also Ghost's only weakness. It's pretty weird, and it really doesn't matter because, you know, Lick is the only means of Ghost-type damage in RBY. Defensively, the Ghost-type resists Poison and Bug, which, like, whatever, but the real shit comes into play with the immunities. The Ghost-type is immune to Fighting and Normal-type attacks, and obviously, that Normal-type immunity is fucking huge. Normal is insanely cracked in Generation 1, and normal type attacks are everywhere. So being able to switch in completely free on a predicted normal type attack is hugely beneficial. This alone makes the ghost type incredible on paper. But unfortunately, there's only one ghost type piece of paper, and it's got a big fucking purple stain on it. Because all ghost types in RBY are also part poison, and that's notable for being exclusively bad. You get pretty much nothing from it other than a grass resistance and a toxic immunity, which sure. And that also means that you're now weak to Psychic and Earthquake, which is really fucking bad. A pure ghost type in RBY would probably be insane, but it just kind of doesn't exist, and that's a real damn shame. Speaking of real Pokemon, I guess we should probably start talking about them now, starting with Gengar. Gengar is in Overused, and in Overused it's a pretty damn good Pokemon. It's currently ranked at 11th on the OU viability rankings, and while that's noticeably lower than a lot of other overused Pokemon, it's still got a very solid place in the tier, and it's solidly above stuff like Moltres, Articuno, all these lower tier Pokemon that just happen to have a niche in the tier. Gengar has a ton of desirable traits, but arguably the most important is its normal immunity. I already touched on this, but this is amazing. Being able to come in for free on something like a predicted Body Slam or even a Hyper Beam or Explosion is hugely beneficial. And thanks to Gengar's good speed stat of 110, you can potentially outspeed the opponent on the next turn and threaten Sleep, consistent damage, or even Explosion. Speaking of Sleep, Gengar is actually the fastest Pokemon in the game with the capacity to induce Sleep, and that's a really valuable thing to have. On top of just being a generally useful tool, it gives Gengar a spot in the lead metagame of RBY. Notably, it can scare out the slower sleep-inducing leads like Exeggutor or Jinx or maybe Chansey, but it doesn't really want to take its chances against paralysis leads like Starmie or Alakazam. It is worth noting though that unlike the likes of Exeggutor or Jinx, Gengar is relying on the 60% accurate Hypnosis for sleep, which is not ideal. Unlike something like a Sing Chansey, Gengar is not bulky enough to where it can really afford to miss Hypnosis, and it makes Gengar a pretty inconsistent lead, so personally I've always avoided it in that position. Still, even with its inconsistencies, Hypnosis is a very valuable tool to have, and sometimes you don't even have to click it to get use out of it. The threat of Hypnosis alone can sometimes be enough to get something done, because while it may only have a 60% chance to land, that might not be a 60% chance the opponent is willing to risk, and you can play around a potential switch. Another tool Gengar has that plays into this really well is Explosion. Now, Gengar's Explosion is not the strongest on the block, its attack is not great, but still, it's a really valuable tool for potentially opening up holes in the opponent's team for your teammates to take advantage of, or nathing something that's coming in on a predicted Hypnosis. For example, something like a paralyzed Chansey or Alakazam might want to come in on Gengar because they're expecting a Hypnosis and they'll get a free turn out of that. But they could very easily switch into an Explosion, and that can give your team some much needed momentum. Gengar is a Pokemon you do have to be willing to take a couple risks with, but the payoff can be potentially massive. Lastly, Gengar has some pretty decent damaging options despite the lack of stab. Nightshade is good consistent damage against every single Pokemon in the game, and Thunderbolt is a decent option that smacks the tier's water types while also doing decent damage outside of that thanks to Gengar's good special stat. Those 4 moves make up Gengar's most commonly used moveset, but it does have a handful of other options. Mega Drain is definitely the most notable, specifically because it 2-hit KOs Rhydon and Golem. That is pretty good if you can pull it off, but unfortunately it's not so easy in practice because both these Pokemon 1-hit KO Gengar with Earthquake. Ideally you want to put them to sleep first or try and hit them on the switch, but it is a little bit of a shame because they're really the only 2 Pokemon you actually want to hit with Mega Drain. Other than that, Confuse Ray is decent if you want to be annoying, and funnily enough, Counter is a potentially very silly option. This might seem pointless because Gengar can't get hit by the normal and fighting type attacks that Counter is supposed to, counter, but in practice it's actually pretty cool. If you bring in Gengar after the opponent knocks out one of your Pokemon with a normal or fighting type attack and then use Counter with Gengar, you can actually counter the attack that knocked out your previous Pokemon. This is really cool, especially if the previous Pokemon died to like an explosion or something, but it's pretty tricky to pull off in practice. Overall, Gengar is a potentially incredible Pokemon that's just held back by its inherent inconsistencies. Getting the most out of Gengar really requires good switch-ins on normal type attacks or smart usage of Hypnosis and Explosion, and without that, Gengar isn't really anything special. Its damage without Explosion is pretty unremarkable, and while it is immune to Body Slam, it is deathly afraid of paralysis from the likes of Starmie, Alakazam, and Jolteon. A big part of what makes Gengar work is being able to outspeed the opponent after it comes in on a normal type attack, and, you know, if you're paralyzed, that's probably not happening. Another issue with Gengar is having to constantly dance around Psychics and Earthquakes that are just everywhere and overused. Gengar is a very tricky Pokemon to use, and despite the fact that it's a good Pokemon in overused, it's actually one of my least used, and I promise that is specifically because of its inconsistencies, and not because I'm biased, because it just completely walks the shit out of Pinsir. No, I promise it's just a Pokemon that I haven't really felt like using.
Next up we have Haunter, and I'll tell you right out the gate, Haunter is strictly a UU Pokemon. Haunter doesn't have any kind of magic niche in overused, I can assure you. It is strictly a worse version of Gengar. And to be completely honest, regarding Haunter in UU, it's a little tricky to talk about because not only has UU just gone through a ton of changes lately, but it's looking like it could go through a whole lot more. Like, just as an example, if you look at the latest RBY UU viability rankings, you'll notice that Haunter is at 12th. Oh, that's kinda cute. Gengar was at 11th, Haunter's at 12th. Oh, that's kinda fun. And look at that, it's right above two other sleep-inducing Pokemon. Wait a fucking minute. So, yeah, this VR is pretty outdated. Since it was made, the combination of agility and partial trapping has been banned in RBY UU, sleep has been banned, and arguably most notably, there's a whole ass meta-defining threat who's just not fucking here. Since this was made, Lapras dropped to UU, and it's an absolute fucking menace. Alongside Hypno, Lapras is incredibly dominant in RBY UU, and both of them are very solidly top 2. And Lapras dropping has led to the unthinkable happening. That being Tentacruel going from the absolute best Pokemon in the tier to just really good. Because of the somewhat volatile nature of RBY UU at the moment, I figured I'd do things a little bit differently with Haunter. Usually I just talk about what these Pokemon are doing right now, but I figured this would be a fun opportunity to talk about what Haunter used to do, predating Lapras and the two bans I just mentioned, and then we'll touch on what it's doing right now. So, let's get into it. So, back then, Haunter really was a mini Gengar. It was to UU what Gengar was to OU. In fact, it ran pretty much the exact same set of Hypnosis, Explosion, Nightshade, and Thunderbolt. The main difference was that instead of Mega Drain being your go-to other option, it was actually Psychic. Psychic did a little bit less than Thunderbolt to Tentacruel, but the chance for a special drop was a potential game changer, and it was also really nice to have for the Haunter Mirror. Just like Gengar in Overused, Haunter was the fastest user of Sleep in RBY UU, which was a really nice trait to have, again, even if you were relying on Hypnosis. And, again, just like Gengar, Haunter made great use of its normal immunity, although you'd typically be blocking something that Gengar usually didn't have to worry about, and that's Wrap. Taking no damage from Wrap was actually a really amazing trait in RBY UU, and really still is. You do get trapped by Wrap even though you take no damage, but of course, taking no chip damage from it makes it a lot easier to play around or potentially stall out. Wrap was and still is way more common in RBY UU than it ever was in RBY OU, so this is something that Haunter really appreciates. Another thing about Haunter that's kinda cool is that, unlike Gengar, it actually got a little bit of use out of its poison typing, although don't get me wrong, it was still very much detrimental. Toxic wasn't exactly the most common thing, but it definitely existed in the tier, which is a whole lot more than you can say for RBY OU. The grass resistance also came into play a whole lot more than in OU, because it allowed Haunter to come in on something like a Venusaur Razor Leaf or a Tangular Mega Drain, and potentially scare them out with Hypnosis or Psychic. Another thing Haunter had, and still has, I'll touch on that later, going for it, was an amazing matchup versus Persian. Persian has been a consistently excellent Pokemon in UU, and Gengar just completely shuts it down. Unlike Tauros or Snorlax in Overused, Persian doesn't have access to Earthquake, and because of that, it seriously struggles to dent Haunter whatsoever. Its best bet is Thunderbolt, which is a measly 6-hit KO. Haunter's main issues were very similar to Gengar's really. It's an inherently inconsistent Pokemon because again, it relies on good reads to make the most out of it, and relying on the inaccurate Hypnosis can really come back to bite you. On top of that, Haunter also has some pretty nasty matchups. Kadabra is 1-hit KO'd by Explosion, but it outspeeds, can threaten Paralysis with Thunder Wave, and can 2-hit KO with Psychic. You might assume Haunter beats the brakes off Kangaskhan because normal immunity, but no. Kangaskhan's Earthquake is a 2-hit KO, and it's only really scared of Hypnosis. While it takes a pretty significant chunk from Nightshade, Dugtrio is also a great answer to Haunter, because it outspeeds and can 1-hit KO outright with Earthquake, which is really scary. Now, all of this is well and good, but it mostly applies to past Haunter. What's Haunter getting up to right now? Well, believe it or not, it's actually doing pretty dang good. Obviously, it's not running Hypnosis anymore, because, Sleep is banned, and in place of that, it's opted for Confuse Ray, which is still handy in its own right. The Grass Resistance is no longer useful at all, because with Sleep banned, every single Grass type in UU just fell off the face of the earth. They really don't matter anymore. Haunter's normal immunity is still fantastic, especially the Wrap immunity, that's still very important even with Agility and Partial Trapping banned, but arguably Haunter's biggest selling point is now the Persian matchup. Haunter was always amazing in the Persian matchup, but what sets it apart now is that it's kind of your only answer in the Persian matchup in a lot of ways. See, back then, Omastar was also a great answer for stopping Persian, because its rock typing gave it a normal resistance. However, Omastar is not eating at all in current UU, because it has a fucking horrific matchup versus Lapras. It doesn't hit Lapras with anything, and Lapras can 3-hit KO with Thunderbolt. Haunter, however, still answers Persian, and it can hold its own against Lapras too. Lapras does decent damage, but Haunter can 3-hit KO with Thunderbolt, so it's doing pretty well for itself. Haunter might be better in UU right now than it ever has been, and it mostly is the Persian matchup and being decent against Lapras that does that for it, so we'll see how things develop, but for now, you love to see it. Good for Haunter. So, with Haunter being good in Underused, in a similar vein to how Gengar was good in Overused, you might assume that things are the same for Gastly in Never Used. And I hate to break it to you, but not really. The only first stage Pokemon that's ranked as Never Used in RBY is Execute, and while its bulk is only passable, it's got a lot of other great defensive traits to help make up for that. It resists some very common attacks such as Psychic, Earthquake, and Thunderbolt, and on top of that, it has access to not only consistent sleep in Sleep Powder, but consistent paralysis thanks to Stun Spore. And even with that, it's only like a mid-tier Pokemon in RBY NU, it's currently ranked at 11th. Gastly's bulk is even worse than Execute's, and instead of resisting common attacking types, it's weak to Psychic and Earthquake, and that's a really big deal. Mr. Mime's Psychic does over 70% minimum to Gastly, Charizard's Earthquake has nearly a 60% chance to 1-hit KO, and Nidoking's Earthquake always 1-hit KOs Gastly. And on top of that, all of these Pokemon outspeed Gastly.
I'm just power walking. What are you friggin' doing that for? You're just gonna die.
This is a big problem Gastly has in Never Used. Unlike Haunter and Gengar, Gastly's 80 speed isn't actually that great by Never Used standards. It's okay, but you really wish it was better. For a start, it's not the fastest sleeper in Never Used. That title goes to Venomoth and Poliwhirl. Ooh, too soon? Yeah, too soon. Again, Gastly is not useless in Never Used. It does have a few good matchups, like Raticate and Pinsir, and it's currently ranked at 26th, which is definitely above some stuff. However, where Gastly has done fairly well for itself is PU. I mentioned in the last Pokemon video that I played in an RBY-PU tournament a while back, and Gastly did pretty well for itself there. It was the 18th most used Pokemon, and it did have a positive win rate. Also, thanks to 13 of the top 16 players from that tournament, none of which were me, GG's, well played, submitting their own personal viability ranking for RBY-PU, we actually have an official RBY-PU viability ranking to talk about. And Gastly's doing pretty dang alright. It's currently ranked at 13th, and listen, I know the RBY UU viability rankings don't really matter currently, but I do think it's kinda cute that Gengar was ranked at 11th in OU, Haunter was 12th in UU, and Gastly is 13th in PU. You know, it's kinda cute. It's fun. Now, Gastly being ranked at 13th actually makes it the lowest ranked PU Pokemon, with everything below it currently being ZU. But make no mistake, this does not detract from how useful Gastly is in RBY-PU. It's still a great Pokemon. It's not the fastest sleeper in the tier, but it's definitely your best option for a fast sleeper. It's second only to Poliwag, who is not that great of a Pokemon in RBY-PU, and is also relying on Hypnosis, so both are inherently a little inconsistent. Being a good fast sleeper gives Gastly an important place in RBY-PU's lead metagame, and it's got a lot of utility outside of that. It can stall out rap shenanigans from Dragonair without being super afraid of anything else that Dragonair can throw at it. It can come in on anything from Machamp except Earthquake and outspeed it on the next turn. It deals with the tier's water types fairly well, and it can check some important physical attackers like Scyther and Pinsir, although it's not a completely concrete answer. Scyther can hit it pretty hard with a +2 wing attack, and while I distinctly remember it walling the shit out of my Pinsir when I played in tournament, it turns out that in PU, the best Pinsir set is 4 attacks, so it's pretty likely that Pinsir will have Seismic Toss, which is a 3-hit KO. I just stuck with Swords Dance and didn't run Seismic Toss, so might be. One last thing that's kind of important to note about Gastly is that unlike Gengar and Haunter, it typically doesn't bother with Explosion, and that's fair. It would be a very, very weak Explosion, that's for sure. Typically, Psychic is your go-to option for the 4th move, because being able to hit Nidoqueen is really important considering it's kind of the best Pokemon in the tier. It also hits other Gastly, and it has great neutral coverage, only being resisted by Abra, Drowsy, and Slowpoke. So yeah, it's great to have. Gastly is a good-ass Pokemon in RBY-PU, and it's nice to see it do well somewhere after fumbling around in NU rather unsuccessfully. However, Gastly has a little bit more than being a great Pokemon in PU on its resume. See, Gastly solidifying itself as a PU Pokemon is a bit of a recent development, and before that happened, it had a little bit of a runabout in ZU, where it was a bit of a fucking problem and ended up getting itself banned. Gastly in ZU was just really hard to answer. It did have checks, but they just weren't super concrete. Arbok was the other best Pokemon in the tier, and you'd think it would be a perfect answer, but not quite. For a start, it speed ties with Gastly, which is annoying, and Earthquake isn't a guaranteed 1-hit KO. So, with a bit of luck, Gastly can come out on top with Hypnosis. Diglett outspeeds and 1-hit KOs with Earthquake, but other than Thunderbolt, it couldn't really switch into Gastly that well. Flareon seemed like a good answer, but again, Gastly could definitely cheese its way past it with some Psychic Special Drops or a lucky Hypnosis. Gastly was just really fucking annoying in ZU, and pretty much everyone was happy to see it leave. So yeah, that's everything I have to talk about when it comes to the Ghost type in RBY. Despite the fact that there's only 3 of them, and they're all part of the same evolution line, there was weirdly a lot to talk about. Especially Gastly. Gastly has been all over the fucking place. Still, this was really fun to talk about. So yeah, with all that out the way, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye.